I thought the hardest part of burying my husband Frank would be saying goodbye to 52 years of marriage. I was wrong. The hardest part was watching my son Jake swagger up to the graveside in a $2,000 suit, flanked by a lawyer in an even more expensive one demanding half my ranch, before the dirt had settled on his stepfather's coffin. 3 years had passed since Jake slapped me across the face and stormed out of my kitchen swearing he'd get what was rightfully his when we were dead. Now here he stood, legal papers in his manicured hands, that same cruel smirk twisting his lips. But I just smiled back at him because, unlike Jake, I knew exactly what Frank had written in that updated will. 3 years earlier, I was humming along to the morning radio show while scrambling eggs for Frank's breakfast when Jake burst through our kitchen door without knocking. My heart jumped at the sight of him. At 38 years old, my adopted son still had that lost boy look that had captured my heart when I married Frank and inherited an 8-year-old whose mother had abandoned him for a trucker heading to California. But something was different about Jake that morning. His hands shook as he poured himself coffee, and dark circles shadowed his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Morning, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "You look tired. Everything all right at the construction company?" Jake owned a small residential building firm that had been struggling since the housing market took a downturn. Frank and I had already helped him through 2 rough patches covering his payroll when jobs dried up. We'd never asked for repayment because family doesn't keep score sheets. "Mom, I need to talk to you and Frank." Jake's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "It's important." Frank appeared in the doorway, fresh from his morning shower, silver hair still damp and combed neat. At 71, my husband remained the most handsome man I'd ever known, all broad shoulders and gentle eyes that crinkled when he smiled. But he wasn't smiling now as he took in Jake's agitated state. "What's going on, son?" Frank had called Jake son from the day we married, never treating him as anything less than his own blood. Jake's composure cracked like ice in spring. "I'm in trouble. Bad trouble. I owe some people money and they're not the patient type. The eggs started burning in the pan, but I couldn't move to turn off the stove." "How much money, Jake?" "200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Frank stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "200,000, Jake? What in God's name did you do?" That's when the whole ugly truth spilled out. Jake had been gambling for 3 years, starting with friendly poker games that escalated to high-stakes underground casinos in Billings. When his business began failing, instead of coming to us for help, he'd borrowed from loan sharks to keep gambling, convinced the next big win would solve everything. The men he owed weren't just criminals. They were dangerous criminals who'd already made it clear what happened to people who didn't pay their debts on time. "They gave me 2 weeks, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. 2 weeks to come up with the full amount, or they're going to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Frank and I exchanged the kind of wordless communication that comes from 5 decades together. We both knew what we had to do. "We'll help you," I said immediately. "We can take out a loan against the ranch, maybe sell some of the North pasture land to the Hendersons. They've been asking about it for years." But Jake was already shaking his head. "That won't be enough and it'll take too long. I need cash now." He took a shaky breath. "I need you to sell the ranch." The kitchen fell silent except for the sizzle of ruined eggs. Frank turned off the burner while I stared at my son in disbelief. "Sell the ranch." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Jake, this land has been in my family for 5 generations. My great-great-grandmother homesteaded here in 1878. "It's just land, Mom. It's not worth dying over." "Just land." Frank's voice carried a warning. "This isn't just land, Jake. This is your mother's heritage. This is where we built our life together." Jake's desperation transformed into something uglier. built your life together. What about my life? I'm your son and I'm in danger, but all you can think about is some old dirt and a falling down house. That's not fair, I said, reaching for him. We want to help you, but selling the ranch isn't the answer. We can get you into treatment, help you start over. Treatment. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think those men care about treatment. You think they're going to wait while I work through my feelings in group therapy. Frank stepped between us. Lower your voice, son. We're trying to help you think clearly here. Don't tell me what to do. Jake's voice cracked like a whip. You're not my real father anyway. You married my mother for this ranch, and now you're both choosing it over me. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Frank's face went pale, not from anger, but from the deep hurt of having 30 years of love thrown back in his face. I felt something break inside my chest, watching this boy I'd raised destroy the man who'd been the only father he'd ever really known. That's enough, I said, my voice gaining strength. Frank has been more of a father to you than your biological father ever was. He walked the floors with you when you had nightmares. He taught you to ride and hunt and fish. He paid for your college when you barely graduated high school. Don't you dare stand in his kitchen and tell him he's not your real father. Jake's face twisted with rage and something else that looked like shame. Fine. But when I end up floating in the Yellowstone River, you'll know it's because you cared more about dead ancestors than your living son. We do care about you, I said, tears starting to blur my vision. That's why we can't enable this anymore. Selling the ranch won't solve your gambling problem, Jake. It'll just give you more money to lose. What happened next still haunts my dreams. Jake crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and slapped me across the face so hard my teeth rattled. The sound echoed off the walls like a gunshot. My hand flew to my burning cheek as I staggered backward, more from shock than pain. Frank exploded into motion, grabbing Jake by the shirt and slamming him against the refrigerator hard enough to knock magnets to the floor. You raise your hand to my wife again, and I'll break it off at the wrist. Jake shoved Frank away, breathing hard. For a moment, I thought he might actually swing at his stepfather. Instead, he straightened his jacket and looked at me with eyes as cold as January. This ranch will be mine when you're dead, he said, each word delivered like a nail in a coffin. And there's nothing you can do about it. He walked out without another word, leaving Frank and me standing in our kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of our family. I sank into a chair, finally letting the tears fall while Frank gathered me in his arms. It's all right, sweetheart, he murmured into my hair. He didn't mean it. He's scared and desperate, but he didn't mean it. But I knew better. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd just threatened the 2 people who'd loved him most. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in my heart. For the first time in 30 years, I understood that loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you. We need to protect ourselves, Frank, I whispered against his chest. We need to change our wills. Frank held me tighter, and I felt him nod. Tomorrow, he promised. First thing tomorrow. Neither of us knew that tomorrow would bring news that would change everything we thought we knew about protecting our future. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 weeks later when I found insurance papers scattered across Frank's desk in his study. Frank was the most organized man I'd ever known, filing everything in labeled folders with military precision. Seeing important documents just lying there made my stomach clench with worry. The letterhead read, Montana Oncology Associates, and my hands shook as I picked up the top page. Appointment confirmations, test results, treatment options. Words like pancreatic cancer and stage 4 jumped off the paper like venomous snakes. Frank. I called out, my voice echoing through our empty house. He'd gone into town for supplies, or so he'd said. Now I realized he'd probably gone for another doctor's appointment he'd hidden from me. When Frank returned 3 hours later, he found me sitting in his desk chair with the papers spread before me like evidence of a crime. His face went ashen when he saw what I'd discovered, and he aged 10 years in the span of a heartbeat. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Frank closed the study door and sat heavily in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where he'd taught Jake to tie fishing flies 15 years earlier. 6 weeks since the diagnosis. 6 months, maybe 8, if I'm lucky, according to Dr. Martinez. 6 weeks. The words felt foreign in my mouth. "You've known for 6 weeks, and you didn't tell me." "I didn't want to worry you until I knew for sure what we were facing." Frank's voice broke on the last word. I kept hoping the tests were wrong, that maybe it was just an ulcer or something treatable. I stood up so fast the chair rolled backward into the bookshelf. "Worry me, Frank, I'm your wife. I've been your wife for 28 years. You don't get to decide what I can and can't handle." "You're right." Frank buried his face in his hands. "God, Serena, you're absolutely right. I've watched this cancer eat my father alive when I was Jake's age. I've seen what it does to families. I thought maybe if I could spare you even a few weeks of that pain." My anger dissolved as quickly as it had risen. This beautiful, stubborn man had been carrying this terror alone for 6 weeks, trying to protect me even from his own mortality. I came around the desk and pulled his hands away from his face, holding them between mine. "We face this together," I said firmly. "Whatever time we have left, we face it together. No more secrets, no more trying to protect me from reality." Frank nodded, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. "I'm scared, Serena. Not of dying, but of leaving you alone, especially after what happened with Jake." The mention of our son brought fresh pain. We hadn't heard from Jake since that terrible morning 3 weeks ago, despite Frank calling his office repeatedly. According to his secretary, Jake had left town on business, but we suspected he was hiding from his creditors. "That's exactly why we need to plan," I said, settling into Frank's lap the way I had when we were newlyweds. "We need to make sure you're remembered for the good man you are, not the bitter words Jake threw at you." Over the following days, Frank underwent a battery of tests while I researched estate attorneys. The cancer was aggressive and had already spread to his liver. Surgery wasn't an option, and chemotherapy would buy him a few more months at the cost of quality of life. Frank chose quality. "I want to spend whatever time I have left on this ranch with you," he told Dr. Martinez during our joint appointment. "I want to watch one more spring come to the valley, see the cattle grow fat on summer grass, and help Serena prepare for a future without me." Dr. Martinez, a compassionate woman in her 50s, nodded with understanding. "We'll focus on pain management and maintaining your strength. There are support services available for both of you." Frank squeezed my hand. "We've got each other. That's all the support we need." But we both knew we needed legal support too. Patricia Holbrook came recommended by 3 different ranching families who'd used her services for estate planning. A sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, Patricia had built her practice on protecting family legacies from greedy relatives and predatory developers. "Tell me about your son," Patricia said during our first meeting in her downtown office. Frank and I had already explained about Jake's gambling debts and violent outburst, but Patricia needed details. "I adopted Jake when he was 8. I began, my voice steady despite the pain. His biological father was never in the picture, and his mother abandoned him when she ran off with another man. Frank and I raised him as our own, loved him as our own. But lately, he's shown you exactly who he really is," Patricia finished gently. "This isn't uncommon, I'm afraid. Adult children who've never faced real consequences often turn on the parents who've enabled them when those parents finally set boundaries." Frank leaned forward in his chair. What are our options? We don't want to cut Jake off completely, but we can't let him gamble away 5 generations of Serena's family history either. Patricia smiled, and I caught a glimpse of the sharp legal mind that had built her reputation. We're going to create a trust with performance conditions. Jake can inherit, but only if he proves he's worthy of the inheritance. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia outlined a strategy that was both brilliant and bulletproof. Frank's will would place half the ranch in a trust for Jake, but he could only access it by meeting specific requirements living and working on the ranch for 2 consecutive years, completing addiction treatment and passing regular sobriety tests, contributing $50,000 of his own money to ranch improvements, and gaining written approval from both the ranch workers and neighboring families. What if he contests the will? I asked. These conditions are legally sound and demonstrably in Jake's best interests, Patricia explained. Courts favor wills that encourage rehabilitation over those that simply hand money to addicts. Plus, we're not cutting him off entirely. We're giving him a path to redemption. Frank nodded slowly. And if he can't or won't meet the conditions, then his share goes to Serena outright, with provisions for her to donate portions to causes Frank specifies. Agricultural education veteran services, whatever reflects your values as a family. As we left Patricia's office, Frank took my arm. Are we doing the right thing? I thought about the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the meadow then, about the man who'd slapped me in my own kitchen. We're giving him a chance to become the man we raised him to be. What he does with that chance is up to him. What we didn't know was that Jake was already making plans of his own. 3 days after our meeting with Patricia, Tom Bradley called with disturbing news. Tom had ranched the property adjacent to ours for 40 years and was Frank's closest friend. Thought you should know, Tom said, his voice tight with concern. I saw Jake out on your north boundary yesterday with some men in suits. They had surveying equipment and were taking pictures. Frank's jaw clenched. What kind of men? Corporate types, expensive cars, city clothes. One of them had business cards from AgriCorp Industries. I felt the blood drain from my face. AgriCorp was a massive farming conglomerate that had been swallowing up small family ranches across Montana, turning them into industrial feedlots that poisoned groundwater and destroyed rural communities. He's already planning to sell, I whispered. Frank's hand found mine. Then it's a good thing we're planning too. That night, Frank sat me down in our living room and pulled out a small leather journal I'd never seen before. I've been writing down everything I want you to know about running this place alone, he said. Every contact, every seasonal routine, every piece of family history you'll need to keep our legacy alive. I took the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with Frank's careful handwriting documenting everything from veterinarian phone numbers to the story of how my great-grandmother had hidden the family's savings in a coffee can during the Great Depression. This ranch isn't just land, Serena. It's a living library of everything our families have learned about surviving and thriving in this valley. Don't let anyone tell you it's just dirt and grass. As autumn turned to winter, Frank's condition worsened, but his spirits remained strong. We spent hours planning every detail of the trust, every condition Jake would need to meet. Frank insisted on video recordings explaining his reasoning, wanting Jake to hear directly from him why the conditions existed. I love you, son, Frank said into Patricia's camera during one of our final meetings. These conditions aren't punishment. They're the last gift I can give you, a chance to become the man I know you can be. By Christmas, Frank was confined to a wheelchair, but he insisted on decorating our tree the way we had for 28 years. We didn't hear from Jake over the holidays, though. Neighbors reported seeing him in Billings at the casino riverboat that operated on the Yellowstone. He'll come back, Frank said on Christmas morning, his voice weak but certain. When he hears I'm gone, he'll come back. But this time, you'll be ready for him." I kissed my husband's forehead and prayed he was right about me being ready, because deep down I knew Jake's return would bring a war I wasn't sure I was strong enough to fight. Frank passed away on a cold February morning, holding my hand as the sun rose over the mountains that had watched over our family for 5 generations. His last words were a promise. "The ranch will protect you, sweetheart. Trust the ranch." As I sat beside my husband's still form, listening to the wind whisper through the pines he'd planted as a young man, I made my own promise. Jake would get his chance at redemption exactly as Frank had planned. But if he chose war instead, he'd discover that 30 years of loving him had also taught me exactly how to defeat him. The morning of Frank's funeral dawned crisp and clear, the kind of February day that makes Montana winters bearable. I stood at my bedroom window watching the sun paint the snow-covered mountains pink and gold, wearing the black dress Frank had always said made my eyes look like emeralds. He'd bought me this dress for our 25th anniversary dinner, and it seemed right that he should see me in it one last time. By 10 o'clock, Riverside Cemetery was filled with more people than I'd expected. Frank had touched so many lives during his 73 years. Neighboring ranchers stood beside their wives' weathered hands clasped over hearts as Pastor Williams spoke about a man who'd treated the land and his family with equal reverence. The entire crew from Henderson Feed and Supply had closed the store to attend. Even some of Frank's old Army buddies had driven up from Wyoming to pay their respects. Tom Bradley and his wife Martha had positioned themselves on either side of me like protective bookends. Their presence gave me strength as I listened to the pastor's words about Frank's character and legacy. Everything felt peaceful and dignified, exactly the way Frank would have wanted. That peace shattered when a black limousine pulled through the cemetery gates. I recognized Jake immediately, even though he looked like a stranger. Gone was the work-stained construction worker I'd last seen in my kitchen. This version of my son wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, Italian leather shoes that had never touched ranch dirt, and a gold watch that caught the sunlight like a warning signal. But it wasn't Jake's expensive makeover that sent whispers through the gathered mourners. It was the man walking beside him, Marcus Wheeler, a lawyer, whose reputation preceded him like a bad smell. Wheeler specialized in inheritance disputes and had earned the nickname the Vulture for his talent at picking apart family estates before the bodies were cold. Jake and Wheeler approached the graveside with the confidence of men who owned the world. Jake's eyes swept over the assembled crowd with something that looked like contempt, as if these salt-of-the-earth people who genuinely loved Frank were somehow beneath him now. Pastor Williams paused mid-sentence as Jake positioned himself directly across from me at the foot of Frank's coffin. The disrespect of the timing hit me like a physical blow. Frank wasn't even in the ground yet, and Jake was already making his move. "Please continue, Pastor," Jake said with false solemnity. "I wouldn't want to interrupt my stepfather's service." The emphasis on stepfather was deliberate and cruel. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Tom Bradley's jaw tightened, and I saw his wife Martha reach over to squeeze his arm in warning. Pastor Williams finished the service with admirable composure, but the damage was done. The sacred moment had been poisoned by Jake's presence and the unspoken threat that radiated from Wheeler like heat from a furnace. As the crowd began to disperse, offering me quiet condolences and promises of support, Jake and Wheeler remained planted beside the grave, like twin monuments to greed. I knew they were waiting for privacy to make their demands, but I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "If you have something to say to me, Jake, say it now." I called out my voice, carrying across the cemetery. In front of these people who loved Frank. Jake's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing surprise at my directness. He'd expected the same timid woman he'd slapped 3 years ago. Instead, he found someone who'd been forged by grief into something harder. "I don't think this is the appropriate time or place," Wheeler interjected smoothly, his voice oozing false concern. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss the estate settlement." "There's nothing to settle," I replied, pulling the death certificate from my purse. "Everything was decided long before today." Jake stepped forward, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the sour scent of desperation. "Actually, Mom, there's quite a bit to settle. I've been doing some research on inheritance law, and it turns out adopted children have the same rights as biological ones." The crowd, which had been slowly moving toward their vehicles, began to slow and listen. Jake had counted on this. He wanted witnesses to his claim, people who'd go home and talk about the drama at Frank's funeral. "Of course you have rights," I said calmly. Frank made sure of that. "But rights come with responsibilities, something you might have forgotten." Wheeler pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase with theatrical flair. "Mrs. Walsh, my client, has legitimate concerns about the validity of any recent changes to your husband's will. Changes made by a dying man under emotional duress rarely hold up in court." That's when I heard the car engine behind me. A small red Honda was pulling through the cemetery gates, and my heart lifted when I recognized the driver. Patricia Holbrook stepped out of her car, looking every inch the formidable attorney in her navy wool coat and sensible heels. Jake's confident smirk faltered when he saw Patricia approaching with her own briefcase. Wheeler's eyes narrowed as he recognized a worthy opponent. "Gentlemen," Patricia said pleasantly, "what a surprise to see you here. I'd have thought you'd at least wait until after the burial to start circling." "Ms. Holbrook," Wheeler replied with mock courtesy. "How thoughtful of you to join us. I trust you have the relevant documents with you." Patricia's smile could have cut glass. "Oh, I have documents. The question is whether you're prepared to hear what they contain." Jake's patience finally snapped. "Enough games. I want what's rightfully mine. Half of everything Frank owned, including this ranch. I'm his son, and I don't care what hoops he tried to make me jump through." A murmur ran through the remaining crowd. Several ranchers stepped closer, their weathered faces hard with disapproval. Jake had just revealed his true character to the entire community, and they didn't like what they saw. Tom Bradley spoke for all of them. "Frank Walsh was twice the father to you that most men are to their blood sons. Show some respect." Jake whirled on Tom with vicious anger. "Mind your own business, old man. This is between my family and me." "We are your family," Martha Bradley said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd raised 5 children of her own. "We've been your family for 30 years. We celebrated your graduations, attended your wedding, comforted your mother when you broke her heart. If you can't see that, then you're even more lost than we feared." For just a moment, Jake's face crumpled. I saw the little boy who used to run to Martha for cookies and comfort when Frank was teaching him hard lessons about responsibility. But Wheeler's hand on his shoulder pulled him back to the present. "Touching," Wheeler said with obvious distaste, "but legally irrelevant. My client wants an immediate accounting of all assets and a timeline for distribution. Anything less, and we'll be forced to contest the will in probate court." That's when Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "Funny you should mention probate court, Mr. Wheeler, because that's exactly where this will is headed. Not because Jake is contesting it, but because Frank specifically requested judicial oversight of the inheritance conditions." Jake went pale. "What conditions?" Patricia's voice carried across the cemetery like a bell. "The conditions Frank set for you to inherit your share of the ranch. Conditions that demonstrate whether you've learned anything from the mistakes that led to your estrangement from this family." "What kind of conditions?" Jake's voice cracked like a teenager's. The kind that require character commitment and genuine remorse. I said, finding my voice again. The kind that prove you're worthy of Frank's legacy. Jake looked wildly between Patricia and Wheeler, clearly expecting his lawyer to produce some legal magic that would sweep away any obstacles. Instead, Wheeler was studying Patricia's document with growing alarm. "This is manipulation," Jake sputtered. "It's coercion. You can't force someone to jump through hoops to get what's legally theirs." "Actually," Patricia said pleasantly, "courts regularly uphold inheritance conditions that encourage rehabilitation and family reconciliation, especially when the beneficiary has a documented history of substance abuse and financial irresponsibility." The words hit Jake like physical blows. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was still the same reckless man who'd gambled away everything and slapped his mother when she wouldn't enable his addiction. Wheeler finally found his voice. "We'll see what a judge thinks about these alleged conditions. In the meantime, my client has every right to access the property that's rightfully his." "No," I said, the word ringing with absolute finality. "He has the right to earn access to that property by proving he's changed. Until then, this ranch remains under my control exactly as Frank intended." Jake's mask finally fell away, completely revealing the desperate, angry man underneath. "You can't do this to me. I'm your son." "Yes," I said sadly, "you are my son. That's why Frank gave you this chance to redeem yourself instead of simply cutting you off. But you have to choose whether you want to be our son or our enemy. You can't be both." As if summoned by the tension, a news van pulled through the cemetery gates. I recognized the local station's logo on the side, and my heart sank. Someone had tipped off the media, turning Frank's funeral into a public spectacle. Jake straightened his tie and walked toward the approaching reporter with the smooth confidence of a man who'd planned this moment. Within minutes, he was telling his version of the story to a sympathetic young woman with a microphone. "My stepfather tried to manipulate me from beyond the grave," Jake said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. "I'm just a grieving son trying to honor my family's legacy, but certain people would rather see that legacy destroyed than allow me to inherit what's rightfully mine." The reporter ate it up, asking leading questions about family dynamics and inheritance disputes. Wheeler hovered nearby, providing legal commentary that painted Jake as a victim of elaborate manipulation. But Jake had made a critical error. He'd forgotten that this community had known him since he was 8 years old. As the news crew packed up, Tom Bradley approached their van. "You might want to get the full story," Tom told the reporter. "Ask around town about Jake Walsh's gambling debts and how he treated his parents when they tried to help him." The reporter's eyes lit up. She'd stumbled into a real story instead of just a staged publicity stunt. As her crew began interviewing other mourners, Jake's confident expression turned worried. Patricia touched my elbow gently. "We should go. Let them talk to empty air." As we walked toward Patricia's car, Jake called after me. "This isn't over, Mom. I'll get what's mine one way or another." I turned back to face him one last time. "Yes, you will get exactly what you've earned. Nothing more, nothing less." Driving away from the cemetery, I caught sight of Jake in the passenger mirror standing beside Frank's fresh grave, with his expensive lawyer and his manufactured grief. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt truly grateful that my husband wouldn't have to witness what our son had become. But I also felt something else, a cold, hard certainty that Jake was just getting started. The funeral had been his opening move in what he clearly intended to be a war. Well, if Jake wanted a war, he'd get one. But this time, he'd be fighting an opponent who'd learned from the master strategist he'd helped bury. Frank had taught me that battles aren't won by the angriest or the loudest. They're won by the most prepared. And thanks to my husband's careful planning, I was very prepared indeed. Patricia's law office felt like a courtroom the following Tuesday morning, heavy with tension and the weight of impending judgment. I arrived early wanting to claim my psychological territory before Jake and his legal army descended. The conference room's long mahogany table gleamed under fluorescent lights, surrounded by enough chairs to accommodate what Patricia had warned would be quite a crowd. Jake strutted in 20 minutes later like he owned the building, flanked by Wheeler and two additional lawyers, whose names I didn't catch. Behind them came a nervous-looking man clutching a leather portfolio whom Wheeler introduced as our property assessment specialist. Jake had dressed for victory in another expensive suit, this one navy blue, with subtle pinstripes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Morning, Mom," Jake said with false brightness, claiming the chair directly across from me. "Sleep well?" I'd actually spent most of the night reviewing Patricia's notes and the video recordings Frank had made explaining his decisions, but Jake didn't need to know about my preparation. "Like a baby," I replied evenly. Frank always said a clear conscience makes for peaceful sleep. Jake's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Wheeler spread legal documents across the table like a general deploying troops, each page marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. The man clearly enjoyed his theatrical displays of legal firepower. "Before we begin," Wheeler announced, "I want it on record that my client objects to any proceedings that deny him immediate access to his inheritance. We reserve the right to challenge any irregular conditions or manipulative clauses." Patricia entered the room carrying a simple manila folder and a small digital recorder. Her understated appearance made Wheeler's elaborate preparations look desperate by comparison. "Good morning, everyone," Patricia said pleasantly, taking her seat beside me. "I trust everyone received copies of the meeting agenda." "We did," Wheeler replied curtly, "though I notice it's remarkably light on actual substance." "Oh, there's plenty of substance," Patricia assured him. "We just prefer to let the documents speak for themselves rather than prejudicing the proceedings with inflammatory rhetoric." She opened her folder and withdrew a thick document bound in blue legal backing. The sight of it made Jake sit up straighter like a predator catching scent of prey. "This is the last will and testament of Franklin James Walsh, properly executed on December 15th of last year in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary public. All parties have been provided with certified copies, but I'll read the relevant portions aloud for clarity." Patricia's voice took on the formal cadence of legal proceedings as she began. "To my beloved wife, Serena Walsh, I leave the house all personal property and 50% of the ranch land to be held in fee simple absolute." Jake nodded approvingly. So far, everything matched his expectations. "To my son, Jake Walsh, whom I have loved as my own blood for 30 years, I leave 50% of the ranch land, all livestock, and all agricultural equipment." Patricia paused, letting Jake's smile widen before she continued. "However, this bequest is conditional upon the following requirements being met within 24 months of my death." The smile froze on Jake's face. Wheeler leaned forward, his pen poised over a legal pad. Patricia cleared her throat. "Condition 1. Jake Walsh must establish legal residence on the ranch property and actively participate in daily operations for a minimum of 2 consecutive years." "What?" Jake's voice cracked like an adolescent's. Patricia continued without acknowledging his outburst. "Condition 2. Jake Walsh must successfully complete a court-approved substance abuse treatment program and submit to random sobriety testing administered by a licensed third party." Jake shot to his feet so fast his chair rolled backward. "You can't be serious." Condition 3. Patricia read relentlessly. Jake Walsh must contribute $50,000 of his own funds toward ranch improvements, as approved by the ranch foreman and documented by receipts. Wheeler was scribbling frantically now, but his face had gone pale. These weren't the kind of conditions he could easily challenge in court. Condition 4. Jake Walsh must obtain written endorsements from at least 3 neighboring ranch families and 2 current ranch employees testifying to his character and commitment to responsible land stewardship. The property assessor looked confused, clearly unprepared for inheritance conditions instead of simple asset division. Jake was pacing behind his chair now, his careful composure completely shattered. "This is insane," Jake said. "It's manipulation, coercion, elder abuse. Frank was dying when he wrote this. He wasn't thinking clearly." Patricia held up a small device I recognized as the digital recorder Frank had used for his video messages. Actually, Frank was very clear about his reasoning. "Would you like to hear his explanation in his own words?" She pressed play, and Frank's voice filled the room strong and steady despite his illness. "Jake, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably angry about the conditions I've set for your inheritance. I want you to understand that these conditions aren't punishment. They're the last gift I can give you." Jake sank back into his chair, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Frank's voice continued patient and loving, despite everything that had passed between them. "I've watched you struggle with gambling addiction and poor choices for years. Your mother and I enabled those choices because we loved you, but love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's fear disguised as affection." I felt tears prick my eyes hearing Frank's wisdom one more time. Across the table, Jake's hands clenched into fists. "These conditions give you a chance to prove that you've learned from your mistakes. They give you time to rebuild the character I know you possess. Most importantly, they protect your mother's heritage while giving you the opportunity to become worthy of it." The recording ended in silence. Jake stared at the device like it had personally betrayed him. Wheeler found his voice first. "Emotional manipulation aside, these conditions are legally questionable. We'll be challenging their enforceability." "On what grounds?" Patricia asked mildly. "Undue influence for starters, a dying man making irrational demands under emotional duress." Patricia smiled. "Frank made these videos over a 6-week period with full mental capacity. We have medical documentation of his cognitive state from Dr. Martinez. We also have testimony from the witnesses who observed his deliberate, thoughtful process." She pulled out another document. "Additionally, these conditions are well within legal precedent. Courts regularly uphold inheritance requirements that encourage rehabilitation, education, or character development. In fact, there's a Montana Supreme Court case from 1998 that's almost identical." Wheeler's confidence was evaporating like morning mist. "What if my client can't meet the conditions? Then his inheritance reverts to Serena with portions designated for charitable donations to causes Frank specified. Agricultural education programs, veteran services, addiction treatment facilities." Jake found his voice again, but it came out as a broken whisper. "How am I supposed to come up with $50,000? I don't have that kind of money." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Jake was finally grasping the reality of his situation. "You could get a job," I suggested gently. "Save your money instead of gambling it away. Prove that you're serious about changing." But Jake's momentary vulnerability vanished, replaced by familiar anger. "Get a job. I own a construction company. I'm not some minimum wage nobody." "You own a failing construction company with massive debts," Wheeler corrected with brutal honesty. "According to the financial disclosure you provided, your business is essentially bankrupt." The property assessor cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps I should leave. This seems to be a family matter now." "You can go," Jake said bitterly. "Turns out there's nothing to assess. Unless you're interested in evaluating my prospects for living in my mother's charity case trailer." After the assessor left, the room felt smaller and more intimate. Jake slumped in his chair, finally looking like the desperate man I knew him to be rather than the confident heir he'd pretended to be. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice small and lost. "Some kind of compromise or payment plan." Patricia shook her head. "The conditions are what they are, Jake. Frank spent months crafting them with input from addiction specialists and family counselors. They're designed to give you the best possible chance of success. Success at what? Becoming a ranch hand for my own inheritance. Success at becoming the man Frank raised you to be," I said quietly. "Success at proving you're worthy of 5 generations of family legacy." Jake looked at me with something that might have been recognition, as if he was finally seeing me as a person instead of an obstacle to his desires. "What if I can't do it?" he asked. "What if I try and fail?" "Then you fail knowing you gave your best effort," I replied. "That's more dignity than you've shown in 3 years. Wheeler packed up his documents with sharp, angry movements. "We'll be filing a formal challenge to these conditions within 30 days. This kind of manipulation shouldn't be allowed to stand." "File whatever you want," Patricia said calmly. "But I'd advise your client to start working on meeting the conditions instead of fighting them. He's got 24 months, and that time starts now whether he's ready or not." Jake stood up slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident facade completely demolished. "I need time to think about this." "Take all the time you need," I said. "But remember that the clock is ticking, and every day you waste fighting these conditions is a day you could have spent proving yourself worthy of them." After Jake and Wheeler left, Patricia and I sat in the quiet conference room reviewing what had just happened. "How do you think he'll respond?" Patricia asked. I thought about the lost look in Jake's eyes when he'd asked what would happen if he failed. "Honestly, I think he'll try to find an easier way first. Jake's never met a problem he couldn't charm or bully his way out of. It's going to take time for him to accept that this situation is different. And if he doesn't accept it?" I stood up and smoothed my skirt, feeling older but somehow stronger than I had in years. "Then he'll get exactly what he's earned. Nothing more, nothing less." But as I drove home to the empty ranch house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's quiet surrender had been too easy. I'd raised him for 30 years, and I knew his patterns. When Jake felt cornered, he didn't give up. He got creative. And creativity in Jake's hands had always been a dangerous thing. 2 weeks passed in blessed silence after the will reading. I threw myself into ranch work with an energy I hadn't felt since Frank's diagnosis, rising before dawn to check on the cattle and staying busy until exhaustion guaranteed dreamless sleep. The physical labor felt good, reminding my body that it was still strong, despite the emotional battering it had endured. That peace shattered on a gray March morning when I looked out my kitchen window and saw Jake's pickup truck parked beside our main barn. My coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the tile floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. I hadn't heard him arrive, which meant he'd either come very early or very late. Neither option suggested good intentions. Throwing on my work coat, I marched across the yard to confront him. I found Jake inside the barn, photographing our equipment with his cell phone while scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Mom. Just conducting a little inventory, making sure everything that's supposed to be here is still here. You have no right to be on this property without permission." "Actually, I do." Jake pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "According to the will, I'm entitled to access my inheritance for assessment purposes. Wheeler drew up this little court order just to make everything official." I snatched the paper and scanned its contents. Legalese filled the page, but the gist was clear. Jake had convinced a judge to grant him access to ranch facilities for the purpose of evaluating potential inheritance assets. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Evaluate away, but I'm staying with you every minute." Jake's smile widened. Suit yourself. I've got all day. What followed was the most uncomfortable 6 hours of my life. Jake wandered through every building on the property taking pictures and measurements, while maintaining a running commentary clearly designed to provoke me. "This old hay baler's probably worth more as scrap metal," he mused, kicking at the machine Frank had meticulously maintained for 15 years. "And this tractor's got to be from the 1980s. No wonder the ranch barely turns a profit." "We do fine," I replied tightly. "Define fine. Because from what I can see, you're sitting on about $2 million worth of land that's generating maybe $50,000 a year in income. That's not fine, Mom. That's a massive waste of resources." By afternoon, Jake had moved on to taking photographs of our boundary markers and surveying stakes. When I demanded to know why, he just shrugged. "Market research. Gotta know what we're working with." That evening, Tom Bradley called with disturbing news. "Serena, I hate to worry you, but I saw some strangers on the ridge overlooking your south pasture today. They had surveying equipment and were taking measurements." "What did they look like?" "City folks. Expensive trucks, clean clothes. One of them had business cards from AgriCorp Industries." My blood ran cold. AgriCorp was the agricultural corporation that had been systematically buying up family ranches across Montana, turning them into industrial farming operations that destroyed rural communities and poisoned local water supplies. "How long were they there?" "Couple hours. They left right around the time Jake drove past on his way back to town." After hanging up, I sat in Frank's study staring at his old ranch maps. Red pins marked every property AgriCorp had purchased in our county over the past 5 years. They formed a pattern around our land like a noose slowly tightening. The next morning brought a new violation. Our south fence line had been cut in 3 places, allowing our cattle to wander onto the state road. I spent 2 hours with Miguel Santos, our ranch foreman, rounding up confused steers and repairing the damage. "This wasn't accidental," Miguel said, examining the clean wire cuts. "Someone used bolt cutters and they knew exactly where to cut for maximum damage." Miguel had worked for us for 12 years, starting as a seasonal hand and working his way up to foreman through sheer competence and loyalty. A quiet man in his mid-40s, he'd immigrated from Mexico as a teenager and built a life through honest work. Frank had trusted Miguel's judgment completely, and so did I. "You think Jake did this?" Miguel's weathered face remained diplomatically neutral. "I think whoever did this knew our routine. They knew which pastures we'd be checking first and which ones we'd leave until afternoon." Over the following days, the sabotage escalated. Someone contaminated our water troughs with motor oil, forcing us to drain and scrub every container on the property. Our main gate lock was super glued shut, requiring an expensive locksmith to restore access. Salt licks disappeared overnight, only to turn up scattered across neighboring properties. Each incident was minor enough to avoid serious damage, but major enough to cost time and money. Worse, they demonstrated intimate knowledge of our daily operations. "It's psychological warfare," Patricia explained during our emergency meeting. "Classic harassment techniques designed to wear you down and make you question your ability to manage the ranch alone." "Can we get another restraining order?" "Based on what evidence, cut fences and contaminated water could be blamed on vandals or disgruntled former employees. We need proof Jake's involved." That proof came 3 days later, when Miguel's 14-year-old son, Carlos, spotted someone near our equipment shed at 2 a.m. Carlos was a responsible kid who'd been helping with early morning chores to earn money for a new bicycle. He'd arrived early and hidden when he heard voices. "There were 2 men," Carlos told us, his young face serious with responsibility. "One was Senor Jake. The other was a stranger with tattoos on his neck." "What were they doing?" "They were putting something in the gas tanks of the tractors. Sugar, I think. The stranger had a bag of it." Sugar in gas tanks was an old sabotage trick that could destroy engines worth tens of thousands of dollars. But Carlos's quick thinking had saved us. He'd stayed hidden until the men left, then immediately called Miguel. "We got there in time to drain the tanks before starting the engines," Miguel explained. "But this is getting dangerous, Serena. These aren't just pranks anymore." I called Sheriff Roberts that morning, but his response was frustratingly predictable. "Without video evidence or witnesses willing to testify, it's just your word against Jake's. And family disputes don't usually involve criminal charges unless someone gets hurt." "So we have to wait until someone gets hurt?" Sheriff Roberts, a decent man in an impossible position, shook his head sympathetically. "Install security cameras, document everything. If we can build a solid case, I'll arrest him myself." The cameras went up that afternoon, but Jake seemed to know about them almost immediately. The sabotage stopped, but something worse began: a whisper campaign designed to destroy my reputation in the community. Suddenly, longtime suppliers were questioning my credit. The feed store owner mentioned concerns about my ability to pay bills on time. The veterinarian asked if I needed to set up a payment plan for routine services. When I demanded explanations, the responses were always the same. "Someone mentioned you might be having financial troubles." Jake's strategy was becoming clear. He couldn't break the will conditions through legal challenges, so he was trying to break me through social and economic pressure. If I couldn't maintain the ranch's operations, the inheritance would revert to him by default. But Jake had underestimated something crucial: the loyalty of people who'd known Frank and me for decades. Tom Bradley was the first to push back. "Bull crap," he told the feed store owner when Jake's lies reached him. "Serena Walsh has been paying her bills on time since before that boy was out of diapers. If someone's spreading rumors about her finances, you'd better consider the source." Word spread quickly through the ranching community. Within days, Jake's whisper campaign had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, it had galvanized my supporters. Neighbors began calling to offer help with ranch work. Local businesses extended better credit terms as a show of support. Even the bank president stopped by to assure me that Frank's careful financial planning had left the ranch on solid ground. "Your husband was a smart man," he told me over coffee in my kitchen. "He knew this day might come and he prepared for it. You've got enough resources to weather whatever storm your son thinks he's creating." But the validation came at a psychological cost. Every day brought new evidence that the boy I'd raised had become a stranger determined to destroy everything Frank and I had built together. The Jake who used to bring me wildflowers had been replaced by a calculating enemy who studied my weaknesses and exploited them without mercy. The lowest point came when I found Miguel cleaning graffiti off the side of our barn. Someone had spray-painted "Old Woman Go Home" in crude red letters across the weathered wood. "I'm sorry you had to see this," Miguel said quietly. "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault." I stared at the ugly words, feeling something harden inside my chest. "Miguel, do you think I should sell the ranch and move to town?" Miguel set down his scrub brush and looked at me with the respect I'd earned through decades of fair treatment. "Señora Serena, my grandfather used to say that the land chooses its people, not the other way around. This land chose your family 5 generations ago. It chose Frank when he married you, and it chose you to protect it now." His words reminded me of Frank's last promise. "The ranch will protect you, sweetheart. Trust the ranch." That night I called Patricia with a new request. "I want to install more cameras. I want motion sensors. I want a security system that would make Fort Knox jealous." "That's going to be expensive." "Frank left money for ranch improvements. I think protecting the ranch from sabotage qualifies." By the end of the week, our property looked like a small military installation. Cameras covered every approach. Motion sensors guarded every building. Night vision equipment monitored the pastures. If Jake wanted to continue his war, he'd have to wage it under constant surveillance. But Jake was learning too. His next move would be far more sophisticated than sugar and gas tanks, or whispered lies about my finances. He'd realized that destroying the ranch's operations wouldn't be enough to defeat me. He'd have to destroy me personally, and for that, he'd need help from people who understood exactly how to break a woman's spirit while staying within the law. The real war was just beginning. The appointment card arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday morning in late April, printed on expensive letterhead I didn't recognize. Montana Geriatric Health Services was requesting my presence for what they called a routine wellness evaluation, scheduled for the following week. I stared at the card with growing unease. I hadn't made any appointment with a geriatric specialist. At 68, I felt healthy and strong, certainly not in need of specialized elderly care. More troubling, the appointment was scheduled for a Saturday morning at a medical complex I'd never heard of 20 miles outside of town. When I called the number on the card, a cheerful receptionist confirmed the appointment and explained that my concerned family member had arranged the evaluation as a gift. "What kind of evaluation?" I asked. "Oh, just a comprehensive checkup to make sure everything's working properly upstairs, if you know what I mean," the woman said with practiced sympathy. "Memory, cognitive function, that sort of thing. It's really quite thoughtful of your son to be so concerned about your well-being." My blood chilled. Jake was behind this, but what was he planning? I called Patricia immediately. "This feels like a trap." "It probably is," Patricia agreed. "But you should go anyway. If Jake's trying to have you declared incompetent, refusing a medical evaluation would only support his case. Just be very careful about what you say and what you consent to." "Should I bring someone with me?" "Absolutely. Bring Miguel or Tom, and whatever you do, don't sign anything without reading it thoroughly." The medical complex turned out to be a shabby building in an industrial park, nothing like the professional facilities I'd expected. The sign outside read, "Montana Geriatric Health Services," but the parking lot was nearly empty for a Saturday morning. Tom Bradley had insisted on driving me, and his presence provided comfort as we walked into the sterile waiting room. A young receptionist with too much makeup and nervous energy checked me in, asking me to fill out extensive paperwork about my mental state and family relationships. "Some of these questions seem pretty personal," Tom observed, reading over my shoulder. "Dr. Harrison likes to be thorough," the receptionist explained. "He believes mental health is connected to family dynamics." The forms asked detailed questions about my relationship with Jake, whether I'd experienced recent grief or depression, and whether I'd been making impulsive financial decisions. One section required me to list all medications and supplements I was taking, along with any recent changes in sleep patterns or appetite. After an hour-long wait, Dr. Harrison emerged from his office. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with carefully styled hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the shabby clinic. His smile was too wide and too practiced. "Mrs. Walsh, so wonderful to meet you. Your son speaks of you with such concern and affection." "My son arranged this appointment." "Oh yes, he's very worried about you. Dealing with grief alone can be so challenging for women your age." Dr. Harrison ushered me into his office while Tom remained in the waiting room. "Now, let's start with some simple cognitive assessments." The tests began innocently enough. Dr. Harrison asked me to remember lists of words, perform simple mathematical calculations, and answer questions about current events. I felt confident in my responses, but his reactions seemed oddly disappointed. He murmured, making notes on his clipboard. "Let's try something different." He pulled out a small cup containing what looked like vitamins. "These are just supplements to help with mental clarity during testing. Standard procedure." Something about his insistence made me suspicious. "What kind of supplements?" "Nothing unusual, just B vitamins and ginkgo. Very safe, very effective." But when I reached for the cup, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly. Not from nerves, but from something chemical. I'd like to read the ingredients first. Dr. Harrison's smile tightened. Mrs. Walsh, I'm the doctor here. If you can't trust my professional judgment about basic vitamins, perhaps that's something we should discuss. He was trying to turn my reasonable caution into evidence of paranoia. I pretended to relent, accepting the cup while palming my cell phone with my other hand. As Dr. Harrison turned to make notes, I quickly activated the recording app Frank had taught me to use. Now, Dr. Harrison said, let's talk about your recent behavior. Your son mentioned some concerning incidents: forgetting to pay bills, making poor decisions about ranch management, possibly hallucinating conversations with your deceased husband. I've never hallucinated anything, I said firmly. Memory problems often manifest as confusion about what's real and what isn't. For instance, your son mentioned finding you talking to empty rooms, believing Frank was still there. The lie was so outrageous it took my breath away. I'd never done anything of the sort, and Jake knew it. But Dr. Harrison was documenting my supposed symptoms with clinical precision. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said carefully. Denial is very common in early-stage dementia. Patients often refuse to acknowledge their declining capabilities. Dr. Harrison's pen scratched across his notepad. Now about those supplements. They'll help us get a clearer picture of your cognitive baseline. I pretended to swallow the pills while secretly spitting them into my tissue. Whatever was in those vitamins was intended to compromise my mental state during the evaluation. The recording app continued capturing every word. For the next hour, Dr. Harrison asked increasingly leading questions designed to paint me as confused and incapable. He claimed I'd given contradictory answers to simple questions. He suggested my grief had caused a break with reality. He even implied that my insistence on managing the ranch alone proved I was making dangerous decisions. Your son is very concerned about your living situation, Dr. Harrison said. A ranch is a lot of responsibility for someone experiencing cognitive decline. I'm not experiencing cognitive decline. Again, denial is typical, but we have objective measures now. He gestured to his notes as if they contained scientific proof instead of manipulated observations and outright lies. When the evaluation finally ended, Dr. Harrison handed me several official-looking forms. These are consent documents for ongoing treatment and assessment. Standard procedure. Tom appeared at my side as I examined the papers. They weren't consent forms for treatment. They were declarations of incompetency and agreements to transfer financial decision-making authority to my primary family member. I'm not signing these, I said firmly. Dr. Harrison's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating man beneath. Mrs. Walsh, these forms are for your own protection. Without proper oversight, you could make decisions that harm yourself or others. The only decision I'm making right now is to leave. I gathered my purse and stood up. Tom, we're done here. Dr. Harrison followed us into the waiting room. I'll be required to file a report about today's evaluation. The state takes elder safety very seriously. File whatever you want, I replied. But you might want to make sure your facts are accurate. In Tom's truck, I played back portions of the recorded conversation. Dr. Harrison's voice came through clearly as he made false claims about my mental state and tried to pressure me into taking unknown substances. That's not a legitimate medical evaluation. Tom said, his face flushed with anger. That's a setup. Patricia's reaction was even stronger when I played the recording in her office Monday morning. This is criminal. Attempted fraud, elder abuse, possibly conspiracy. Dr. Harrison just handed us enough evidence to destroy Jake's credibility permanently. But Jake wasn't finished. 3 days later, Sheriff Roberts called with disturbing news. Serena, I've got to ask you some questions. We received a complaint that you've been making threats against your son. What kind of threats? According to the report, you called him Sunday night and threatened to have him killed if he didn't stop interfering with the ranch. The accusation was so absurd, I laughed out loud. Dave, you've known me for 20 years. Do I sound like someone who makes death threats? Sheriff Roberts looked uncomfortable. Course not. But I've got to investigate when complaints are filed. Do you have any proof of where you were Sunday night? Sunday night, I'd been at Tom and Martha Bradley's house for dinner along with 6 other neighbors. We'd played cards until nearly midnight discussing community fundraising for the new volunteer fire station. About 8 witnesses can account for my whereabouts, I told Sheriff Roberts. But more importantly, check my phone records. I never called Jake at all. The investigation revealed what I'd suspected. Jake had filed a false police report claiming I'd threatened him from a number that turned out to be a burner phone purchased with cash in Billings. Someone had impersonated my voice reading threats from a script. But Sheriff Roberts also brought disturbing news about Dr. Harrison's report. He's filed paperwork with the state requesting an emergency competency hearing. Claims you're a danger to yourself and others due to cognitive impairment. My stomach dropped. Based on a fraudulent evaluation, based on what he's calling professional medical assessment. The state has to take these reports seriously, especially when there are family members expressing concern. Patricia worked through the weekend preparing our defense, but Monday morning brought the news we'd dreaded. A judge had granted an emergency hearing to determine my mental competency scheduled for Friday morning. They're trying to railroad you, Patricia explained. Jake's created a paper trail of false evidence, the fake medical evaluation, the fraudulent police report, probably testimony from paid witnesses. He wants guardianship declared so he can control your assets. What happens if the judge believes their lies? You could lose legal control over your finances, your property, even your medical decisions. Jake would become your guardian with authority to make every major decision in your life. The hearing was set for Judge Margaret Foster's courtroom, and Jake arrived with an army of legal support. Wheeler had recruited 2 additional lawyers, a court-appointed psychiatrist, and 3 witnesses I didn't recognize who claimed to have observed my declining mental state. But Patricia had prepared too. She'd arranged for Dr. Martinez to testify about my mental acuity during Frank's illness. Miguel and Tom were ready to describe my competent ranch management. Most importantly, she had the recorded evidence of Dr. Harrison's fraudulent evaluation. The hearing began with Jake's team presenting their case. Dr. Harrison testified about my supposed cognitive decline, describing symptoms I'd never exhibited, and claiming I'd failed basic mental competency tests. Wheeler introduced the false police report as evidence of my increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior. Then came the witnesses. I didn't recognize a woman who claimed to be a grocery store clerk who'd seen me talking to myself and acting confused about simple transactions, and a man who said he'd observed me wandering around the ranch at night in my nightgown, apparently lost. Both testimonies were complete fabrications, but they were delivered with convincing sincerity by people who'd obviously been coached and paid for their performances. Judge Foster listened to everything with professional neutrality, but I could see her growing concern. The evidence against me was mounting, and Jake's legal team had constructed their lies skillfully. Then Patricia stood up for our defense. Your Honor, everything you've heard today is part of an elaborate fraud designed to steal this woman's independence and property. She activated her laptop, and Dr. Harrison's voice filled the courtroom as the recorded conversation played. The effect was immediate and devastating. Dr. Harrison's attempts to pressure me into taking unknown substances, his leading questions designed to create false evidence, and his lies about my mental state were all captured with perfect clarity. But Patricia wasn't finished. She played a second recording I hadn't known existed, Jake's voice on the phone with someone discussing payment for medical testimony and witness preparation. The defense would like to call Jake Walsh to explain these recordings. Jake's face went pale as he took the witness stand. Under Patricia's relentless questioning, his carefully constructed lies began to crumble. He admitted knowing Dr. Harrison personally. He couldn't explain how he'd observed behaviors I'd never exhibited. Most damaging, he couldn't account for the money transfers to his fake witnesses that Patricia's investigators had uncovered. Judge Foster's verdict was swift and brutal. This court finds no evidence of mental incompetency in Serena Walsh. Furthermore, this court finds substantial evidence of fraud, perjury, and elder abuse perpetrated by Jake Walsh and his associates. She ordered Jake's immediate arrest on charges of attempted fraud and elder abuse. Dr. Harrison was taken into custody for medical fraud and conspiracy. The fake witnesses were charged with perjury. As sheriff's deputies led Jake away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. The hatred in his eyes was so pure and intense it took my breath away. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently. But I knew better. It was over. Jake had revealed himself completely, and now the law would deal with him accordingly. Whatever happened next, he'd never again be able to threaten my independence or Frank's legacy. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. The trial began 6 months later on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day Frank and I first saw this ranch together 40 years ago. Jake sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits and arrogant confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who'd finally run out of tricks. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Catherine Mills, had built an airtight case. Jake wasn't just facing local charges for elder abuse and fraud. The FBI had uncovered evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy that painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning 3 years. Mr. Walsh used sophisticated techniques to defraud his adoptive mother, Prosecutor Mills told the jury during opening statements. He bribed witnesses, corrupted medical professionals, and filed false police reports in an elaborate scheme to steal her inheritance through fraudulent guardianship proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed Jake had paid Dr. Harrison $50,000 for the fake medical evaluation. Wire transfers revealed payments to false witnesses. Most damaging, the FBI had recovered Jake's computer files, containing detailed plans for what he called Operation Ranch Recovery. Marcus Wheeler had already pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for testifying against Jake. His testimony revealed the full scope of their plot. Jake Walsh approached me with a comprehensive strategy to discredit his mother's mental capacity. Wheeler told the court his reputation and law license already destroyed. He'd researched elder abuse techniques, studied guardianship laws, and identified corrupt medical professionals willing to provide false testimony for payment. Dr. Harrison's testimony was even more damning. Facing his own federal charges, he'd agreed to full cooperation with prosecutors. Jake Walsh provided me with a script of symptoms to document. Dr. Harrison admitted his medical career finished. He wanted me to diagnose dementia regardless of the patient's actual mental state. The plan was to have Mrs. Walsh declared incompetent so he could gain control of her assets. But the most shocking revelation came when FBI agents testified about Jake's gambling debts. The original $200,000 had grown to over $500,000 through continued gambling and compounded interest. Jake's creditors weren't just loan sharks. They were organized crime figures who'd given him one final chance to pay his debts or face permanent consequences. The defendant was under extreme pressure from criminal associates, Special Agent Rodriguez explained. Our investigation revealed that Mr. Walsh viewed his inheritance as the only way to save his own life. He was willing to destroy his family to protect himself. I testified on the third day, telling the jury about Jake's 3-year campaign of harassment, sabotage, and psychological warfare. My voice remained steady as I described the cut fences, contaminated water, and graffiti. But when I talked about the moment Jake slapped me in my own kitchen, I saw several jurors wipe away tears. "Mrs. Walsh," Prosecutor Mills asked gently, "after everything your son put you through, do you still love him?" The question caught me off guard. I looked across the courtroom at Jake, seeing glimpses of the 8-year-old boy who used to bring me wildflowers and ask for extra bedtime stories. "I love the child I raised," I said finally. "But that child grew into a man who chose greed over family crime, over redemption. The Jake Walsh sitting in this courtroom is a stranger to me." Jake's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer doing his best with an impossible case, argued that addiction had driven Jake to desperate measures. He painted his client as a victim of circumstances, a sick man who needed treatment rather than punishment. But the prosecution's closing argument demolished that narrative. "Addiction doesn't excuse 3 years of calculated criminal behavior," Prosecutor Mills declared. "The defendant didn't steal a car or rob a bank in a moment of desperation. He orchestrated a sophisticated fraud designed to destroy an elderly woman's independence and steal her family legacy." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, Jake's face remained emotionless. He'd run out of anger, lies, and hope. Judge Foster sentenced Jake to 15 years in federal prison with restitution orders that would consume any future earnings for the rest of his life. Dr. Harrison received 7 years and permanent revocation of his medical license. Wheeler was disbarred and sentenced to 3 years for his role in the conspiracy. "Mr. Walsh," Judge Foster said before imposing sentence, "you had every advantage in life. A loving family, educational opportunities, and a guaranteed inheritance that would have secured your future. Instead, you chose to terrorize the woman who raised you and destroy the legacy of the man who called you son. Your crimes represent a profound betrayal of family trust that warrants the maximum sentence allowed by law." As deputies led Jake away for the final time, he didn't look back. There were no more threats, no more promises that this wasn't over. He simply disappeared into the federal corrections system, becoming inmate number 47832-019 at a facility 800 miles from Montana. But Jake's conviction wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something beautiful and unexpected. 3 days after the sentencing, a young woman knocked on my ranch house door. She was tall and slender with Jake's dark hair, but Frank's kind eyes, wearing jeans and boots that looked comfortable rather than fashionable. "Mrs. Walsh, my name is Emily Peterson. I think I'm your granddaughter." Emily was Jake's daughter from his brief marriage 15 years earlier. After her parents' ugly divorce, she'd been raised by her maternal grandparents in Oregon. She was 24 now, a veterinary student at Oregon State, who'd learned about the trial through news coverage. "I've wanted to contact you for years," Emily explained over coffee in my kitchen. "But Dad always said you and Frank didn't want anything to do with me. He said you blamed me for ruining his marriage." Another lie from Jake designed to keep us apart. Emily's mother had never told her the truth that Frank and I had tried repeatedly to maintain contact after the divorce, only to have Jake block every attempt. We sent birthday cards and Christmas presents for years. I told Emily, pulling out a box of returned mail I'd never been able to throw away, "We wanted to be part of your life so badly." Emily cried when she saw the unopened packages, each one marked "Return to Sender" in Jake's handwriting. Inside were photo albums documenting ranch life, children's books about Montana wildlife, and small gifts chosen with love for a granddaughter we'd never been allowed to know. "I thought you didn't care about me," she whispered. Oh, sweetheart, we cared so much it broke our hearts. Emily spent a week at the ranch learning about her family history and falling in love with the land that had shaped 5 generations of strong women. She had Frank's gentle way with animals and my grandmother's practical intelligence. Watching her work alongside Miguel checking cattle and mending fences, I saw the future I'd never dared hope for. I'd like to finish my veterinary degree and come back here, Emily told me on her last evening. If you'd have me. I know Dad destroyed any claim to this place, but maybe I could work for you, help you run things. Emily, this ranch has been waiting for you your whole life. A month later, Emily returned with her fiancé, David Chen, a quiet young man who shared her passion for sustainable agriculture. David had grown up on a small farm in California and understood both the challenges and rewards of working the land. We'd like to develop programs for at-risk youth, Emily explained as we walked the property boundaries. Kids who've made mistakes but deserve second chances. Dad never got that chance because no one held him accountable. Maybe we can do better for others. Their vision aligned perfectly with Frank's final wishes. Together, we established the Frank Walsh Memorial Ranch, dedicating half the property to agricultural education and youth rehabilitation programs. Emily would manage the livestock operation while completing her veterinary degree through distance learning. David would oversee the educational programs and sustainable farming initiatives. The formal dedication ceremony took place on a perfect September morning, exactly 1 year after Jake's conviction. Politicians, educators, and ranching families gathered to celebrate the transformation of a family tragedy into something hopeful and healing. Emily, now 8 months pregnant with her first child, spoke about breaking cycles of selfishness and building legacies of service. David announced their engagement and their commitment to carrying forward Frank's values of hard work, integrity, and community responsibility. But the most meaningful moment came when Miguel approached the podium, his weathered face bright with emotion. "Señor Frank always said the land chooses its people," Miguel told the crowd. "Today we see that he was right. This land chose Señora Serena to protect it, chose Emily to renew it, and chose David to help it serve others. This is not an ending. This is a beginning." As the crowd dispersed, I found myself alone at Frank's graveside, sharing the day's events with the man who'd made it all possible. "You were right about everything," I told his headstone. "The ranch did protect me. The conditions you set didn't redeem Jake, but they protected Emily's inheritance and gave her a chance to heal what he broke." A warm breeze rustled through the pines Frank had planted as a young man carrying the scent of hay and wildflowers and the promise of generations yet to come. Emily was naming her baby Franklin, if it was a boy Francis, if it was a girl. Either way, Frank's legacy would continue in the hands of people who understood that love requires both boundaries and second chances. Jake had chosen to become a stranger. Emily had chosen to become family. The ranch would continue teaching that difference to anyone wise enough to listen. As I walked back toward the house where 3 generations would soon gather for Sunday dinners, I carried with me the most important lesson of this entire ordeal. Family isn't determined by blood or legal documents. It's determined by choice sacrifice and the willingness to put something larger than yourself first. Jake had chosen himself. Emily had chosen service, and that ultimately made all the difference. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries with someone you love, even when it hurt both of you? Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means watching someone we care about face consequences they brought on themselves. Frank's wisdom taught me that boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out. They're bridges built to help people find their way back to who they're meant to be. Jake chose not to cross that bridge, but Emily did, and our family is stronger for both choices. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own struggles with difficult family situations, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Please hit that like button if you believe in the power of resilience, and Second Chances subscribe to hear more stories about family forgiveness and the strength we find in our darkest moments, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to choose love over fear, service over selfishness. Thank you for spending this time with me and letting me share Frank's wisdom about the difference between enabling and loving, between family that's chosen and family that's simply endured. May you find the courage to set the boundaries that protect what matters most. And may you always remember that the best legacies are built not by what we accumulate, but by how we love and whom we choose to lift up along the way. Until next time, keep your hearts open and your boundaries strong.